This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. I don't get to watch movies like I used to, or at least let me rephrase that. I don't have the ability to watch movies like I used to. For one, most of the stuff that comes out is a repeat of something else that's already been done. It's not much effort put into it relative to writing. And secondly, I fall asleep. I just can't avoid it. I'll sit there and I will try and watch a movie and I just can't stay awake anymore. I don't know. It's an odd thing. Because, boy, I used to really enjoy watching films. And I watched a variety of things, plus I had small kids, so I was introduced into the Marvel universe early on. I wouldn't walk across the street to watch one of those movies now. But, I like more intellectual things as well over the years. Room with a View, I don't know. Let's see, what else? I guess probably Kelly's Heroes. That's real intellectual. But anyway, today we're going to talk about a man who utilized a particular type of technology that actually comes up in a very, very famous and well-known Steven Spielberg movie. Of course, I'm talking about Jurassic Park. And the reason that it's significant is that this methodology that this man worked on has led to the exoneration, to the best of my knowledge, of at least 50 people that were in prison, wrongly convicted. And now this man has, in fact, passed on. Of course, I'm talking about Dr. Edward T. Blake. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Hey, Dave, I'm going to do something right now that I have never done with you, and it may fall flat. I have no idea, but I've got to tell you, a joke. Are you ready? This is a career-ending decision potentially, because my timing is not that good. But this is an old coroner joke about a coroner that is on the stand, and it's been through the years I've heard it because it's either a coroner or a forensic pathologist. So let me go ahead and give this a whirl and just see. So imagine you're in a courtroom and there's a coroner, seated in the chair, adjacent to the bench, judge in their stately robes. And there is this fast talking lawyer that is there and, questioning the coroner. And it goes like this. Lawyer: did you check for a pulse before you perform the autopsy? Coroner: no. Did you check for blood pressure? No. Did you check for breathing? No. So then it is possible that the patient was alive when you began the autopsy? No. How can you be so sure, doctor? Because his brain was sitting on my desk in a jar. But could the patient still have been alive nevertheless? Coroner, staring into the eyes of the attorney. It's possible that he could have been alive and practicing law somewhere. So when we talk about Blake, Dr. Blake, though he was not a coroner or a pathologist, he was a forensic scientist, a DNA guy. He took a very contemptible view of lawyers in particular. And here's why. And you encounter this many times with people that are scientists. that have to undergo cross-examination, and because a scientist is not. I would say that they're not as inclined to be a fan of theater. All right, and the courtroom, as we all know, is a it's a location for theater.
Yeah.
You have a lot of bombastic people that are in there, making proclamations and that sort of thing. Scientists tend to be very black and white people. They kind of look at straight down the line, and what's the popular term they use now? All conversations are very nuanced when it comes to attorneys, and I'm being very kind there, because you can take a set of circumstances and kind of twist the language a little bit,
right,
and you come out with a different result. And of course, that result influences the decision makers that are impaneled on the jury.
Right.
And Blake didn't have a lot of time for that. He was not that guy, and he crossed swords for a number of years with attorneys. And I would imagine there were attorneys out there saying, "Oh no, he's on the witness list."
Well, it's funny when you mentioned Blake and his passing last week when we were just talking about doing upcoming shows, and I thought, okay, well, who is this guy? And when you do a quick look, it pops up immediately about the Innocence Project and how Peter Neufeld referred to him, the co-founder of the Innocence Project. And he compared it to a baseball analogy. And it was that Major League Baseball, there are a lot of 300 hitters. And then there's Ted Williams.
Right.
Edward Blake is the Ted Williams of DNA. But I look at the credibility and accountability of character in these individuals that you mentioned go to the courtroom to testify. Because if one thing has been proven over time is you can, with the right amount of money, buy an expert to tell your side of the story from the witness stand and actually tell it without lying. That's something that can be done. Science is a very interesting thing like that. And how you talk about science in different aspects, in particular with DNA. But when Edward T. Blake was brought into the discussion about being on O.J. Simpson's dream team at trial, he was actually on their witness list and then removed. Blake was removed from the witness list for O.J. Simpson, not because he was going to contradict the DNA evidence or that he was going to say anything about it at all. They, being the defense, they were picking apart the prosecution case step by step. And one of those was to pick apart the lab in Oakland that the Justice Department runs that was used by the Los Angeles Police Department when they were getting the DNA test run on the blood and stuff. And they wanted him to testify as to the actual lab and how it was run. And the problem with that was that Blake would not give them the testimony they wanted. He wouldn't. He couldn't be bought. And that's an actual real opinion. It's kind of like you could look at my desk and Joseph Scott Morgan's desk and say, that Dave Mack is a slob. His desk is a mess. Look at Joe's. Joe's desk is perfect. Everything's right where it needs to be. That's the right way to run a desk. And they'd be actually 100% accurate. Blake wasn't willing to do that. And it's not just because the guy that ran the lab was a former student of his. No. It's just he couldn't be bought to tell a story that he did not believe in.
Well, I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. When I was being mentored by the man that, I credit with my career, really, the finest forensic scientist I ever knew. He's passed on now, God rest his soul, my friend Bill. Bill threw a term up at me at one point in time, and I'd never heard it. And I was a neophyte. I mean, I knew nothing. And he had taken several trips around the sun in the world of forensics. He was not real old, but Bill was one of these people that had just completely, submerged himself in the world of forensics and was so well read. And he threw a term out to me, Dave, that for the first time, and it was called forensic prostitute. And and over the years I've heard this. Now Bill took exception to that term because his idea was that, well, if you work in forensic science, you should be able to go out and make a living, for you and your family. And he was saying it from the perspective of anybody. They would tag an individual, anybody that would go and testify for the defense, regardless of their level of morality or whatever it was. They were just blanketed with this term, and he really took exception to it. That there were people out there that just assumed that because you were testifying for the defense, that you had prostituted yourself in some way, that you were paying, that the defense was paying for your testimony to validate, whatever theory it is that they had. And of course, that's not always the case, because you can take a bit of science that you're tasked with examining, whatever the scientific evidence is, and you can look at it and you can arrive at a different conclusion than maybe somebody that's working for the prosecution. And, Blake is a perfect example of this in the sense that he would not prostitute himself. But as years went by, I think he recognized that there were multiple problems in the system, and that this kind of circuitous route that he took to where he wound up and being, kind of in the pantheon of forensic scientists out there, he saw how many people were incarcerated that should not have been incarcerated, Dave.
That is so scary to me, Joe.
It's terrifying. I mean, it really, really is. And how many, I think that personally, I think that you and I ought to do an entire series on body bags of individuals that have been wrongfully, convicted, and particularly as it applies to the victims, because still the individual that is the victim doesn't, they still don't have a voice.
Right.
They're left, and there's no one to answer for their deaths many times.
But you know what? In the case of Edward T. Blake, that big case, the Gary Dotson case, when you actually do a Google search of Edward Blake, Gary Dotson, that's what comes up. That was like the first big case that he was involved in, where a man is sitting in prison for a rape he didn't commit. And one of the things that really bothers me about that case, because I have seen it play out before, is the girl who accused him of rape recanted her story fairly quickly. He didn't do it. I made it up. And that wasn't enough. Now, I understand recanting and all that, but bottom line here is that Gary Dotson was in prison. He was sentenced to 20 to 50 years for the rape of a teenage girl. And even though the girl had confessed to fabricating the evidence, he still was sitting in prison until they were able to get Edward Blake involved and actually looked at the DNA evidence and the semen found in the girl's underwear. And it showed that it was not Gary Dotson.
No, it turned out to be your boyfriend. Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to step on you, but yeah, I mean, it was so striking. And this man has been robbed. He's been robbed of all this time, Dave. Think about all the Christmases and Thanksgivings and, or the potential for your life. Not that you don't have potential if you're incarcerated. Don't misrepresent what I'm saying here. Mm-hmm. It's the idea of those things that you are prevented from doing because someone, as it turns out, was either very lazy or just downright malevolent. We have to think about what is it that really drew Edward Blake into this world. Blake was actually working in the same building where there was a lab, it was a medical lab that was using DNA technology, such as it was back in the mid 80s, to make diagnoses in specific diseases. And a lot of this had to do with cancer treatments and these sorts of things. And what they were focused on was the utilization of fragmented DNA. And Blake, it was related that there was a geneticist that he would run into periodically in the hallway, and they'd have coffee and they'd just sit in the break room and just kind of chat about the utility of different types of DNA technology that existed at that point in time. And he discovered that they were actually using PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which is where you're taking fragmented bits of DNA and amplifying it. So you would take these bits of the fragmented DNA and extend it or replicate it in order to come back and specifically identify an individual without having a full-on robust sample of DNA. In the past, prior to that, you had to have a significant amount of DNA sample in order to, profile an individual. You go back to Alec Jeffreys, who did the first work in DNA technology as it applied to criminal cases. He's in Great Britain, but he was using a completely different type of methodology in order to arrive at these conclusions. And what the light bulb went on with Blake is that a lot of these cases that you come across in the field, first off, it's going to be something that's partial. It's going to be something that is potentially degraded. You think about all of these rape kits over the years, Dave, that have been sitting on shelves and have been essentially kind of rotting away. And, what are you going to do with that? Is there anything left that we can actually use? And, with PCR, he said, wow, this has got real potential, real utility here, because if you can find something that goes back years and years, and suddenly that becomes a touchstone where you can utilize all that remains in order to literally peel the pages back, go back in time, and look where we are today. You think about the stuff that's being done, just with our friends at Othram, and you talk about Brave New World. It's a place that we, that back then at that particular time, no one could have even have fancied this. And Blake was literally on the cutting edge of this technology, Dave.
You talked about Steven Spielberg in your opening.
Yeah.
And the movie is Jurassic Park. If you could explain for me how that fits in with PCR, because I think for most of us, if you haven't seen the movie Jurassic Park, it's not too late. Watch the first one. Now, I don't care. I don't know anything about any of the sequels or anything like that, but watch the first one, because it is a scientific breakdown of what Joe's talking about on screen in an entertaining way.
Yeah. And so when I'm glad you brought me back to it, because it's kind of an amazing bit, right? And the main character in here, or the scientist, I think, who played that? I can't remember who played that part. Anyway, I know he's a famous British director, but he actually played the role of the scientist in this. Remember, for those of you that have seen the movie, if you haven't seen it, they find a piece of amber, which essentially comes from the sap of a tree. That's where, amber is generated. And they actually, I think they show a image of this happening, where a mosquito who had actually gone onto a dinosaur, extracted the blood from a dinosaur, and then gets caught up into the sap of a tree. It created over a couple of million years, it created this chunk of amber. They were able to burrow down into the amber and extract the contents contained within the mosquito, specifically the the dinosaur blood, if you will, which of course would be fragmented. And with what they were hinting at there is this is PCR technology where they were able to go back in and replicate, the genomic sequencing for a dinosaur, and they built this thing out. Now it's very fanciful, all right? I mean, but it's just the idea of seeing this and how it played out, and that's literally, how this kind of ties back to what we're talking about, that you've got something, and in this case, you're talking about millions of years relative to a sample. But it goes back, it paints with a very broad brush this idea of the world that we're in right now regarding technology, where we're actually seeing some of these things have life.
That's what I thought was interesting.
Breathed into them.
Is that it happened? The movie came out in 93. Okay.
Yeah.
Think about that. We actually had this huge hit movie. And by the way, Richard Attenborough is the fellow who played the doctor.
Yeah. Great voice, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Great actor as well as director. Great Escape. He directed Chaplin. Actually, he was doing the movie Chaplin with Robert Downey Jr. and actually using his acting on Jurassic Park. It became an issue. But anyway, Joe and I are actual movie buffs, and we go back and forth on different things. Just so y'all know, it's like everything comes back to. Remember in Tommy Boy when
Yeah.
Anyway, so if you go back and watch Jurassic Park now and watch the DNA and how it's portrayed on screen, it's fascinating. But they actually do explain a lot of those things that we then heard 2 years later in the O.J. Simpson trial. And that's what's fascinating to me is how Hollywood was getting info. That, again, you're talking in 88 is when Blake actually was able to go into court and get a man released from prison who wrongly convicted, for a rape he did not commit, and use this DNA, this type of PCR DNA or the process that developed it anyway. And they're showing it in a movie 5 years later in this fanciful way of bringing back dinosaurs from the dead. From extinction, rather. And it's just incredible to me, Joe, how this whole science becomes fact over fiction so many times. It's fascinating to me.
It does. And it gives you an idea that, you wonder about some of these. And I don't think that, when you're a scientist and you're working in a lab, you're necessarily what do they call it? A futurist. You're not sitting here thinking that, okay, the technology I'm working on right now, I'm looking, decades and decades out in the future. They're not doing that. They don't have the time to be, again, using this term again, that fanciful. They're trying to solve the problem that's in front of them. Isn't it interesting how we can develop methodologies in science like, or applications, let's say that, like Dr. Blake did, where you can take this and you use this for a springboard into something else, and this is another interesting bit to this. There have been a couple of hearings recently in Lisk, the Long Island serial killer case, and I'll never forget. They were protesting. I say protesting. They were arguing that the DNA technology, and I'm painting with real broad brush here, the technology that was being utilized in Heuermann's case, his defense counsel was saying that the DNA science that they're using it's like magic. And I described it in one interview as the defense attorneys are acting like they've discovered fire, for the first time. Well, that's not the truth, because they were saying that the technology has never been used this way. Well, it's been used for years and years in the medical sciences for diagnoses and treatments and these sorts of things. It's now being applied in crime science at this point in time, in forensic science. And so, it has utility all the way. People that develop this stuff, they don't sit there and think, well, gee whiz, maybe someday, there'll be a movie that's based upon this, or, it's the Jetsons or something like that. They don't think that way. They're thinking about what can I do in order to solve the problem. And of course, when you look at Dr. Blake. That's what he was. He was a problem solver, particularly regarding problems that seemed so complex. To many, they seemed unanswerable. But for him, he literally has taken the keys to the jail and unlocked those cell doors. And many have gone free because of this technology. I had a friend of mine many years ago that had worked in morgues, up in the Northeast, had been a pathology assistant, or actually a diener, an autopsy assistant. And he had really gutted it out all those years and was non-degreed. He didn't have a degree. Eventually went on to get one, but he was saying, people, that are successful, they get degreed or credentialed, and then they pull the ladder up behind them, and they don't create a path for everybody else. And that academic status becomes a status that everybody should adhere to. And there's many different ways to become validated in forensic science. Some of it does come through academia, and a lot of it comes through trial and error and spending long hours, either in a morgue or the laboratory or out in the field, working cases. Some of the most brilliant crime scene investigators that actually go in the field that I've worked had nothing more than a high school degree, and they had picked up on the job training. But Blake is a very interesting character because back in the 60s, he had gone to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley.
He was there. He was at UC Berkeley, Joe, in 1968.
Yeah,
you remember all the protesting that was being done at Berkeley in the late 60s?
Yeah, I don't think Blake was really probably deeply involved in that, because he showed up at Berkeley, which, listen, for all of that stuff that went on there, and I think to a certain degree still continues.
It does.
It is one of the most rigorous academic environments you can be in. He started out as a physics major.
Wow.
And it didn't hold his attention. And so he literally switched to forensic science.
How smart are you to be bored by physics?
Well, I don't know. I used to have a buddy of mine that I would eat lunch with at my previous university. And this guy was country as butter, and this guy had a doctorate in astrophysics. He'd gone to Clemson, and I would go and eat lunch with him, and he sounded like he had straw hanging out of his teeth. When he would speak, but then you get him on a roll. And it was always humbling when I would eat with him, because I would realize how stupid I really am. and he's such a gentle soul. And he was brilliant, off the charts. But Blake, for his part, changed over as an undergraduate to forensics, and wound up, starting a career. I think primarily probably working in labs and then becoming a consultant. Went back and, of all things, got a doctorate in criminology, not in criminalistics, but criminology, which is the study of the criminal mind and the behaviors of criminals. And I think he got that like in 1976. So you got a guy that has a doctorate, but the doctorate is not in forensic science. So he's kind of this multifaceted guy. And I think that it was probably shortly thereafter he founded his consultancy, which was located in the Bay Area, called Forensic Science Associates. I think when you begin to marry up what he was seeing in the lab, and then probably what he was witnessing in the culture at the same time, because the criminologist is going to have more of a cultural view, as opposed to that kind of hardline scientific black and white. it's an interesting combination when you think about it. I think a lot of people would think that it's probably oil and water on one level, but for him, he's kind of a Renaissance guy. And that, you move forward that was in 76. He's working cases or consulting on cases as a forensic scientist, primarily, I would imagine, in serology, which, was how we used to type blood, where we're trying to understand, what blood type an individual may have left behind. But that is about as far as you could take it. But, as time went by, Dave, he winds up becoming involved in the O.J. Simpson case, of all things. And I think that's kind of an amazing point. You were discussing this with me off air. He's involved in the case, but yet, Dave, he's not involved in the case.
Right.
And I think that presents a real interesting bit about Blake's life, doesn't it?
I thought it was incredible because DNA became such a big issue in that trial. And when they were calling on Blake to testify, he was on the witness list to testify about specifically the crime lab in Oakland that was used by the Los Angeles Police Department. It's a crime lab run by the Justice Department. And when Blake was asked to testify, he basically said, I'm not going to be able to give you what you want. He's not a hired hand. And that's the part about this. Oftentimes we hear people joking about experts can be hired, I can get an expert to say I'm crazy. You can get an expert to say I'm, sane. And when it comes to this, he would not.
I've got an interesting little side story here about some of the stuff. And this is kind of an example of some of the stuff that was going on out in LA. And it probably approximates about the time of O.J. Simpson. This gives you an idea about the condition of laboratory facilities. When we have a death, did you know that there's a special forensics clothes dryer? Did you know that, Dave?
No, I did not.
And it's not a tumble dryer. There is actually a device. It's like a big glass box, okay, that when you get a bit of clothing that's super saturated with blood, you put it on a hanger and you hang it inside the dryer, okay, and you shut the door, and it literally dries the blood in place, and it's rather complex, but it is a location where these items are secured, they're free from cross-contamination. One of the problems they ran into in LA, and I guess they saw this as a cost-cutting measure, Dave, they were using, what do they say in Mommy Dearest? No wire hangers. They were using
more wire hangers.
They were using wire hangers to hang clothes on. And get this, after they would use them on one case, they would take them and use them on another case. So you're talking about,
what?
Yeah. And they justify it by saying that, I think, and I might be getting my story mixed up here, but I remember this. I had a conversation with somebody at one point in time about this that was from LA. They would put these wire coat hangers into a bucket that had bleach inside of it, had bleach in it, and they would let them sit. And I guess they'd rinse them off to save, they're saving money, by using the same wire coat hangers. And that's so nuts. that gives you an idea, this is an environment where you have to keep it so pristine. And it's a difficult environment to be pristine in because it's so riddled with filth and, all the stuff that you drag in from the streets. These cases are not clean cases. And so you have to take an extra effort to do this. And a lot of this about the coat hanger thing, that was actually discovered by defense attorneys. And of course, immediately they wanted to know how many cases in the past had, where they'd use these contaminated clothes hangers to hang these things up with. He knew this. Blake knew this. He knew, and that's just one small example. And that's something that for all of my friends that work in labs, a big part of working in a lab is quality assurance. You have a specific person that is designated as your QA person that's going to go through, and they're not just checking the methodologies, which they have to, like what testing methodologies are you using? Are they accepted by the courts? Okay. But they're also going around seeing if the stations are clean, if they're meeting the standard that's set forth by their certifying organization. And I guess you fall into the trap of any other kind of governmental organization, that's doing things. You shortcut things, and you make excuses and all this. He knew this. He had the inside track on this, and you compared. I remember you used the example of Van Adder, with
Right.
With OJ, and for our friends, refresh our memory about Van Adder with this blood.
This is something we were talking about before we began taping today, because in the O.J. Simpson case, the reason some of us that followed, I've watched that trial almost every day, and the reason so many of us had issues with the blood wasn't because it wasn't because of the experts that testified about the DNA. It was the way the blood was handled. From the time it was drawn. If you remember, during the trial, there was an extremely long period of time where they had the guy on the stand who draws blood from suspects at the county jail, and he draws a certain amount every time. And in the case of O.J. Simpson, whereas he always allowed to choose a number, say every time he draws between, right around 50, between 49 and 51, right there at 50, that's what he normally draws. But in O.J.'s case, for some reason, he only drew 35. It was substantially less than normal. And the guy that drew it said, I always draw the same amount. This is wrong. There shouldn't have been 35. There should have been 50. It became a big deal. But because there was no picture taken, they were able to argue. The defense was that something was done with that blood. That blood was used. And the thing is, we find out that one of the detectives, Van Adder, had that blood tube and had it along with some shoes and had it in his vehicle when he went to the crime scene at Bundy and the crime scene at Rockingham. So, and in all the places where this blood was found, Van Adder, had taken it there after the crime, and that became a real problem, Joe. And again, that's before you even look at all the DNA issues. Before you look at that, you have a problem with contamination. And for a lot of just people who I'm not a scientist, been around crime stuff for a long time, Joe, but looking at that one example, it takes every other piece of evidence they've got related to that blood and throws it into question.
Yeah, it taints it. It taints it significantly. It really does. And you're blowing apart the rest. Anything else that was valid, maybe with valid science that you're working hard. I think about was it Dennis Fong? I think was his name. Was the criminalist that was out at the scene.
Yeah.
I'll never forget the image of him walking around in a Tyvek suit, and you still got detectives walking around out there in street shoes. With it was such buffoonery. And
grabbing a blanket from inside the house to cover Nicole.
Yeah. And the process of how everything worked. And look, I'm assuming that things to date have, probably gotten better. We hope. But I do know this. I do know that how that case was handled, those cases, it had a direct impact on my profession in the medical legal world. As a matter of fact, it was one of the elements to us, beginning to look at how can we standardize the practices for people in my field nationwide. And it's from that American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators was formed.
Really?
And
I didn't know that.
The genesis of that part of it was relative to the O.J. Simpson case and how it was handled.
Wow.
And so concurrently, you look at Blake and the world of, and I think personally, my field, we've come a long ways. I think in Blake's field, it certainly has, because not only do you have the clarification of duties, but you also have the standards that are set forth. And this guy was a litmus test for them early on and continue to be. He's the person that you'd go back and you'd look at. How are you going to process scenes with very fragile evidence? You've got rape kits. Is there anything that we can still salvage out of a rape kit, even with degraded DNA in old cases, off of clothing that's packed away somewhere? Is there any kind of DNA we can source off of that? How we handle things, and then how we examine things, what methodologies are being used. And here's the thing, his legacy, I think, with Blake is because the benchmarks that Blake established early on in his practice from a scientific perspective that are going to move us forward in the future relative to this technology. We don't know how many other people there are out there that will be identified, how many perpetrators will be put in jail, how many people will be set free. We don't know, but I do know that his impact on the practice of DNA science will ring for many years to come. But most importantly, beyond the science, Blake actually took a stand where many people may have sat back and maybe have cashed the check, if you will. He decided not to do that. He decided to be a man of integrity. And of course, at the end of the day, if you're in forensics, that is your currency. Can you be believed? Can you be trusted? We count Dr. Blake as one of those that could be. Rest in peace. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.